Hi everyone, welcome to the Cecil Gibb Research Seminar Series. This is our week 3 of it in semester 2. We have a great speaker today. We've got Dr. Meeva Sanson joining us. Just before we get started, a few housekeeping rules. Just a reminder to everyone that the seminar is being recorded and will be available on the ANU Psychology YouTube playlist. Upon entry to the webinar, you've been muted. But we'll unmute you at the end if you have questions. At question time, you can either raise your hand or put your question in the Q&A box, and you can do that at any time. So just to introduce you to our speaker today, we're very lucky to have Dr. Meeva Sanson joining us. Meeva Sanson is a research fellow in the School of Psychology at the University of Waikato, New Zealand. Dr. Sanson's research brings cognitive theory to bear on issues of applied importance, and that's chiefly in the domain of clinical psychology. She received her PhD in 2018, and her thesis systematically examined the effects of trigger warnings, revealing these controversial content warnings really have no meaningful impact on people's distress. And Meeva, I'm sure people may follow up with questions on that towards the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, so more recently, Dr. Sanson has turned her attention to the relationship between autobiographical memory and post-traumatic stress disorder. Her work has been funded by the New Zealand Federation of Graduate Women and also Fulbright New Zealand. So welcome, Meeva. We're delighted to have you with us today. And now I'll hand over to you so you can start your talk. So I'll just go off camera.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here and able to share some of my research with you. So just before I start talking about the research itself, I just wanted to acknowledge my collaborators on the work that I'll be talking about today. Melanie Takarangi over at Flinders, Rachel Zayance down at Otago, and Marianne Gary here at Waikato, who is currently my postdoc mentor. And also Holly Wilson and Sarah Perry, who worked on portions of this research for their honours projects. So I'm sure everyone here today has at least heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, but I'd just like to start by elaborating a bit more on what exactly it is, or at least the sort of current or traditional way that it's conceptualized, and what's required for a diagnosis. So first of all, to get a diagnosis of PTSD, people have to experience or be exposed to a traumatic event. And then following that, they develop a range of symptoms about that event in a particular constellation, where they have to have symptoms that span 4 clusters. So the first cluster of symptoms are intrusions, and these are often talked about as the hallmark symptoms of PTSD. So these are things like memories of the traumatic event popping into mind repeatedly and unwanted. Another cluster of symptoms are the avoidance symptoms. So these are things like people going out of their way to avoid reminders of the traumatic event, either internally or externally. The third cluster is negative mood and cognition. So that's things like troubling beliefs about the world. The world is a dangerous place, and about yourself, I'm a bad person, that kind of thing. And those start or become much worse following the traumatic event. And then the fourth cluster is hyperarousal type symptoms. So that's being really jittery, feeling really on edge, heightened startle reflex. And again, those symptoms have to have gotten a lot worse or started after the traumatic event. So according to these diagnostic criteria, there's kind of an implied causal model here, right, where the traumatic event causes people to develop these PTSD symptoms. Although a lot of other theories that try and explain where PTSD symptoms come from introduce this intermediate step in the form of the event memory. So it's not just that the traumatic event happens, but it happens in a way that produces a memory, and then it's the troubling memory that contributes to these PTSD symptoms. So in that way, we can think about PTSD as a memory disorder, which maybe is not what we usually think of when we think memory disorder. We would probably think more of forgetting, whereas in a way this is a problem of remembering too much, if you like. So there are a bunch of theories that all involve this intermediary step of memory, and there's a lot of evidence to support this idea of PTSD as a memory disorder as well. So for instance, if you follow people over time, if their memory gets worse, so they come to misremember the traumatic event as worse than they remembered it being immediately afterwards, then those people tend to have worse symptoms. And conversely, in treatment, the memory is often a target of treatment to help resolve the symptoms. One theory in particular, the gist of it is that it's not just that people remember the traumatic event that's the problem that leads to the symptoms, it's how they remember it. So in particular, it's what we might call the mental characteristics of that memory. So more specifically, how emotional that memory is, how emotionally evocative it is when you bring it to mind, how frequently rehearsed that memory is, and finally how central that memory is. So what that means is how important it is as an event in your, like the story of your life that you tell yourself, and your sense of identity, and a kind of reference point type event for how you make sense of the world. And so really how PTSD symptoms come about is that the traumatic event leads people to form a memory that is really elevated on all of these characteristics. And evidence for this theory comes from studies such as asking people to nominate a negative or stressful memory and then rate these symptoms, these characteristics rather, of that memory, and then ask them about their symptoms. And they find when they do that, that people, the more that their event memory has of these characteristics, the worse symptoms they have. And in another study on clinical population, people with PTSD compared to controls without PTSD, who nominated and rated a negative or stressful event, found that people with PTSD, their event had much higher levels in the mean than control people for all of these characteristics. But there is a problem posed both for this autobiographical memory model of PTSD as well as the other models that rely on memory as a key causal factor in producing the symptoms, as well as the diagnostic model, if you like, that just relies on the traumatic event having happened. And that is that there's a small body of studies in which people report these symptoms without a traumatic event having happened, and therefore without a traumatic memory. So these are what we might call PreTSD symptoms. They're the very same symptoms, except that they, rather than being about an event that's happened, they're about a possible future stressful experience. So for instance, in a couple of these studies, it was pregnant women anticipating childbirth, and in another study it was soldiers who were about to be deployed into a war zone. And so they were reporting that they were having these symptoms that are, if you like, the mirror image of PTSD symptoms. And so the puzzle then is, if we thought that PTSD-like symptoms arise because of the event, because of the memory, then how are we to explain where these PreTSD symptoms are coming from if we have neither of those preceding factors? So we propose that we can resolve this puzzle by turning away from the clinical literature and instead looking to the cognitive and more recently neurocognitive literatures, because there's a huge body of research that shows that when we are bringing to mind the memory of an event, what we're doing in a way is running like a mental simulation of that event, where we're drawing together thoughts and images and feelings and binding them all together into this mental product. And when we imagine a hypothetical event, we're doing a very similar thing. And so the final step in generating one of these events is labeling it, classifying it as a memory based on something that happened in our past, or as perhaps a future event, something that we've imagined might happen to us. But up until that point, it's a very similar process. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, both of these types of mental products can have really similar characteristics. And so both can be emotionally evocative to a greater or lesser degree. Both can be rehearsed with greater or lesser frequency, and both can be central to our sense of self and life story to a greater or lesser extent. So armed with this idea that memories are not a unique mental product, if we turn back to how we might explain PTSD symptoms, what we hypothesize is essentially that people, when they imagine what it might be like were a traumatic experience to happen to them in the future, they generate a representation of that event that has all of these characteristics to some degree. And the more that this event representation is emotional and rehearsed and central, the more PTSD symptoms people would have about that event. So, put another way, what we're suggesting is that PTSD-like symptoms arise from this event representation, regardless of whether an event actually occurred beforehand to lead to that representation. In other words, PTSD and PreTSD symptoms come about via similar mechanisms. And so you might have noticed really what this is an extension to the autobiographical memory model, where we're predicting that more PTSD symptoms, people will experience or report more PTSD symptoms in relation to the mental characteristics of the negative event they have in mind. But no data exist to test this hypothesis because all of those earlier studies I mentioned where people were reporting these PTSD symptoms, none of them actually asked people specifically, what are you concerned about? What is the event you've imagined exactly? And certainly none of them asked about what that event's mental characteristics were like. And so our goal, our overarching goal in the 3 studies that I'm going to tell you about today was to test this hypothesis. So in the first study, our research questions were, when people imagine a negative future event, first of all, how severe are their PTSD symptoms? Can we ourselves get people reporting these symptoms? And how does that compare to the PTSD symptoms people report about a past event? And secondly, how are these symptoms and characteristics associated, both for past events, so can we essentially replicate previous findings, and for future events, do we see the same pattern for PTSD symptoms? So what we did was ask some people to start by nominating and describing a very stressful event that happened to them in the past, and we asked other people to start by nominating a very stressful event they'd imagine might happen to them in the future. Then we asked them to rate the mental characteristics of their event. And so for the past event, we used the autobiographical memory questionnaire, which is a series of items that people rate. So these 3 items were tapping into how emotionally evocative the memory was. So an example item there, that's the emotional intensity item, and people rate them on a scale from 1 to 7, where higher numbers indicate greater emotional intensity. And then we also had 3 items that get at rehearsal, so voluntary, involuntary, and talking about the event, and these also are rated 1 to 7, where higher numbers mean greater frequency of rehearsal. And finally, we use the centrality of event scale to measure how central this event was. So that is, we use the short version, so that is 7 items, each rated, so this is an example item on a 1 to 5 scale, and then a mean score is calculated for centrality. And then we did a very similar thing when it came to the characteristics of the future events. So we basically just tweaked the wording of those items so that they referred to the characteristics of a future event rather than a past event. And then we asked people to rate the symptoms they had had about that event. So for the past condition, we used the PCL-5, which is a list of symptoms that covers all 4 of those clusters I mentioned earlier. People rate each one for the degree to which they've been bothered by that symptom over the past month, from 0 to 4, and then those items are summed. There are 20 in total. And then to measure the symptoms, the PreTSD symptoms about the future event, we used the PreCL-5, which is very closely based on the PCL-5, except that some of the items where needed are reworded to refer to a future experience rather than a past experience. And then we actually did this as a within subject design. So once people had done all of that for their first event, they then went and did it all again for the second event. So what did we find? So our first question was just, can we get reports of PreTSD symptoms, and how do they compare to PTSD symptoms? And what we find is that people are reporting really similar levels of symptoms in both conditions. In neither condition are they reaching the, so that dotted line represents a clinical cutoff, if you like, of probable PTSD. So given that this was a non-clinical sample, it's unsurprising that they aren't over that threshold. But they're reporting really similar levels in both conditions. Second, of course, we were interested in the relationship between the characteristics and the symptoms. So looking first at the past, we find that each of the measures of how emotional the event is were correlated with people's symptoms. Similarly, how voluntarily and involuntarily often people think about the event was related to their PTSD symptoms, although not how often they talked about it. And also how central the event was is correlated with their symptoms. So this is really nice. This is just beautifully replicating what's been found in prior research about the relationship between these characteristics and symptoms. So now if we look to what these relationships were like in the future condition, what we see is basically a really similar pattern, where again, the more emotionally intense, the more frequently rehearsed, and the more central people's representation of this, their imagined future event was, the more PreTSD symptoms they were reporting about that event. So basically this is a collection of results that fits with our hypothesis that in both conditions, these symptoms are similarly associated with these mental characteristics. And so having replicated the past and produced this novel finding for the future about the future condition, in our next study, our goal was simply to replicate these findings about the future event. So in this study, essentially the same research questions. To what extent are people reporting these PreTSD symptoms about a specific negative event they've imagined in the future? And how do its mental characteristics predict the severity of their PreTSD symptoms? But we also had a secondary goal, and that was to see how well these characteristics continued to predict the symptoms once people's tendency to worry had been accounted for. Because one question that we got about that first lot of findings was, Well, when you're measuring PreTSD, are you not essentially just measuring people's tendency to worry about the future? So what we did was a very similar method, although when we went to collect these data, it was April last year, and so the pandemic was really getting into full swing. And so we asked them specifically, what's the worst event they'd imagine might happen to them in the near future due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Then we asked them to rate those 3 key characteristics about that imagined event. We streamlined a little bit there and dropped a couple of items. And then once they'd rated those characteristics, we asked them to rate the PreTSD symptoms they'd been having about that event. We did modify this measure slightly, where we asked people only about how bothered they'd been over the last week rather than over the last month, simply because the situation was changing so rapidly at the time. And then lastly, we put in a little measure about people's general tendency to worry. So this is just 5 items rated on a 1 to 5 scale. This is an example item, and then they're summed so that a higher score indicates a greater tendency to worry. So first of all, looking at people's score on the pre-CL, we found a really similar level of symptoms that people were reporting. So again, just replicating that we can find these symptoms. And more interestingly, we then looked at how those symptoms are predicted by the characteristics of the event that people had imagined might happen to them. And what we found was that the more emotional it was, the more rehearsed it was, and the more central it was, all predicted people's PreTSD symptoms about that event. And overall, this model accounted for about 1/3 of the variance in people's PreTSD symptoms. And then to address our secondary research question about the relationship with worry, we ran a second regression, where in the first step we put in people's tendency to worry, and then in the second step we added back in all of those characteristics. And what we found was that worry did predict people's symptoms. I mean, I think it would have been really surprising if they weren't related. But the key thing here is that for most of these other characteristics, the relationship stayed really similar. So what this suggests is that even once we take out people's general tendency to worry, there's still something, a specific contribution of how people are thinking about this particular event that is contributing to their symptoms about that event. And overall, this second model accounted for getting on half the variance in people's PreTSD symptoms. So to summarize that study, we found again that people were having PreTSD symptoms about events they'd imagine might happen to them due to COVID, and the characteristics of that event were predicting how bad or how troubled they were by PreTSD symptoms about their nominated event. And these predictive relationships still hold even when we first account for people's tendency to worry. So this is a second collection of findings that fits with our hypothesis about where these PreTSD symptoms are coming from, and how, more broadly, how PTSD-like symptoms, both PTSD and PreTSD symptoms, arise. But of course, a better way to test a proposed causal relationship is to manipulate the characteristics and then measure the effect on symptoms. And so in our next study, it's kind of an intermediate step to doing that, where we are basically borrowing from a paradigm that's really common in the trauma literature, asking people, so in the trauma literature, to simulate having a traumatic experience, people are often asked to do things like watch a video of a car crash, and then that stands in as a traumatic event to study mechanisms involved in PTSD. So here we're adapting that by giving people an analog negative future event to imagine, and then again asking to what extent do people report PTSD symptoms about that event, and to what extent do its mental characteristics of how people think about this event that we've specified predict their PTSD symptoms about it. And this will then set us up to be able to manipulate the characteristics of the event we ask people to imagine and see what happens to their symptoms. So in this study, we first of all gave people an audio clip to listen to that we took these materials from a study that was looking at inducing negative emotions. And so we asked people to listen to a short clip describing one of these 6 negative events and imagine that event happening to them, and then elaborate on a little bit and write a little description of how exactly it would end badly for them in the future were it to happen. And then we gave them a short filler task, mainly just to give them a chance to do some rehearsal about that event, to think about it either voluntarily or involuntarily. So what we actually asked people to do was read a short article about the structure of the atom, and we gave them longer than that, so we forced them to stay on the page, and we gave them longer than they would need to read it. The idea being that they would maybe have some involuntary thoughts as they were reading it, but then be sitting there and maybe have some voluntary thoughts while they were waiting for the page to advance. And then we asked them to rate the characteristics of this imagined event, so how emotional it is, how rehearsed it was, and how central it would be were it to happen. And then last, we asked them to rate the PTSD symptoms that they had had about that event since imagining it. And of course, we would expect a much lower level of symptoms here, as is typical for analog trauma studies. But on top of that, you know, some of the items really didn't apply at all. So there were a couple about sleep disturbances, and so we just took those out. So did we see any PTSD symptoms? Yes. As expected, they are experiencing symptoms at a lower level than any of the other conditions in any of our previous studies. And that's possibly, at least in part, to do with having a lower possible total score, but probably also because they really were having fewer symptoms about this event that they had only just thought about for the first time. And second, do we see these same relationships? And the answer is yes. Apart from the degree to which people deliberately thought about the event, and I think that might just be because even though we tried to give them that sort of filler time, that there really wasn't that much opportunity or reason for them to do a lot of voluntary thinking about this event in the space of this quite short experiment. And then, yeah, also centrality. And overall, together, these characteristics accounted for close to 40% of the variance in people's analog PTSD symptoms. So what we can take from this study is that even when people are imagining an analog future event, they still report some PTSD symptoms about that event, and those PTSD symptoms are still predicted by the characteristics of how people imagine this event. So again, this supports our hypothesis, and perhaps more importantly, it paves the way for us now doing some more experimental work to manipulate those characteristics and see what happens to people's symptoms. And so that is in fact something that we're currently working on. We've just got a manipulation working that pushes around some of those characteristics for people's analog events. And so the next step is now to use that manipulation and see what happens to people's PTSD symptoms after, say, you know, a couple of days or a week's delay. And further out into the future, what we would also like to do is look at what happens, taking it back to autobiographical events. What happens if we try and reduce the intensity of the mental characteristics for an autobiographical future event, and see what happens then over a period of time to people's PTSD symptoms. We have been working on trying to get a manipulation to do that, but without success so far. So I'd love it if you had ideas about how we could try and do that. Right, but so for now, this collection of findings suggests that people report PTSD-like symptoms about both past and future events to similar degrees, and more than that, in both cases, those symptoms are associated with the characteristics, the mental characteristics of the event people have in mind that those symptoms are about. And so what we think that suggests is that, as we hypothesized, PTSD and PreTSD symptoms arise from some shared mechanisms. And so this is a hypothesis, the conclusion that wholly fits with the cognitive and neurocognitive work, showing that remembering events and imagining events are really two sides of the same coin. And it also fits with the autobiographical memory model of PTSD, in that it really highlights the importance of the characteristics of how people are thinking about a negative event in terms of how bothered they are by symptoms about it. But it also extends it in a really important way to future events, which then allows us to account for PreTSD symptoms. But these findings suggest that PTSD-like symptoms, so PreTSD and PTSD symptoms, may not be unique to past events or even real events, which, thinking back to the diagnostic criteria and the implied causal model there, that first the event has to happen in order for the symptoms and the disorder to arise. It really doesn't fit with that. Instead, it suggests that it's much more about people's mental representation, regardless of whether that representation arose because of a real event or an imagined event. And so this problem is really one of many problems for PTSD. So another, for instance, being that when it comes to the symptoms, the constellation of symptoms, there are something like 630,000 different combinations of symptoms that all would get people to qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. So I don't know that the solution is just opening up the diagnosis to symptoms of stress about any event, because there's already a real problem of heterogeneity and what kinds of things get to fall under the umbrella of stuff that gets called PTSD, which makes it much more complicated to look for treatments, causes and treatments, and really understand what's going on for all of those people under that umbrella. But I think actually, as well as posing problems for that current conceptualization of PTSD, has really interesting and important implications for treatment, in that these data suggest a really important role for the event representation and that they cause the symptoms, at least in part. And so the more that we understand about how these symptoms arise, the better we are surely able to target those mechanisms. And also, interestingly, for prevention. So turning back to that cognitive literature, we know that once people have a memory of an event, imagining counterfactuals, for instance, can interact with that memory and change how people remember that event. And so it might be the case that we can sort of turn that around and think how people imagine an event before it happens might impact how they come to remember it afterwards. And so by targeting how people are thinking about anticipating events might help us to find ways to prevent or reduce the burden of PTSD after traumatic events as well. Yeah, so I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miva. That was really, really interesting and very thought-provoking. So I'm curious to see what questions we get from clinical colleagues here and also cognitive and social colleagues. So those who have questions, throw your hand up or put something in the Q&A. So we've already got one in the Q&A from Samantha. So interesting talk, Miva. I'm interested to hear how PreTSD might differ from anxiety.
So I think, like in a lot of ways, it probably doesn't. So this is another problem, if you like, for PTSD as a concept, right, is that in this most recent version of the DSM, it's been classed as its own category of trauma-related disorders, but previously it has been classified as a type of anxiety disorder. And so I think that it probably still is a kind of anxiety disorder, but what distinguishes it from perhaps generalized anxiety disorder is the specificity to an event. So whereas in generalized anxiety disorder, you know, one of the cardinal symptoms is worry about all sorts of things, and in this kind of perhaps more abstract and verbal way, whereas PreTSD is about a particular event, and that in fact is the way that the differential diagnosis kind of instructions for differentiating between PTSD and anxiety is whether those symptoms are attributable to a particular event.
Thanks, Miva. Samantha, I can unmute you if you would like to hear a follow-up, or you had a follow-up question. You can just throw your hand up if you'd like to be unmuted. So if you have questions for Miva, you can just put your hand up and I'll track the participants group to see if there are questions there, or also in the Q&A box there too. While we're waiting, Miva, I'm curious to think about, so episodic future thought, thinking about the future and the shared mechanisms with autobiographical memory. It's often sort of conceptualized that in thinking about future episodic events, people are sort of borrowing and using raw ingredients really from autobiographical memory to think about the future. And if that is the case, then is it likely that when people have actually experienced traumatic events, that you're getting a similarity between past events and future events, precisely because, and now I'm thinking this is kind of a mean question, precisely because people are using information from other negative events from the past and constructing their future events by using that stuff as the sort of raw materials. So it does the kinds of attributes that you'd expect.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. So that was a concern that we had about the first study where we did it in that within subjects way, is particularly that the first thing that people nominated might then constrain their search for whatever the second thing they nominated was, and that would sort of account for some of the similarities. So we actually ran a between subjects replication that I didn't mention, but found very similar patterns there as well between the two conditions. And then also in that third study, the analog, we did ask people if they had actually experienced anything similar to the thing they happened to have been assigned to imagine. And we found that, well, I cannot remember the proportion now, but a fair chunk of people had experienced something similar. And so they had, when we separated out into people that had and had not experienced something similar, and so should have more of that kind of previous experience to draw on, and then arguably could even just be recasting their past experience into the future. We found that they did have higher levels of symptoms, but that the relationships between the characteristics and symptoms were very similar.
Well, that's really interesting. have a follow-up, but I'll go back. I can see Jin Wen. You have your hand up, so I'm just unmuting you. There you go. You should be able to speak now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. Sorry, I was a little bit late because of my previous meeting. I just only joining probably this last bit. I was very interested in seeing that the predictive role of worry. So my question is that what kind of you might have already talked about this. What kind of measure or scale did you use to assess this worry? And the second question is relevant to what you have just talked about in terms of the future and the past events impact. And I think that because the worry is very similar to rumination, so whether you have any data or whether you have done any research on this rumination.
So the scale that we used to measure worry was the short version of the Penn State Worry Questionnaire. And no, we haven't included measures of rumination in any of these studies. I think you're probably right, though, that there would be a relationship there to the extent that rumination is common in PTSD, and so this is kind of another facet of that autobiographical memory model that I didn't particularly go into, which is that not only the more a particular event has of those characteristics, the more symptoms people have about that event, but also people with certain individual differences, personality traits, are probably going to be more prone to generating event representations that are higher on all of those characteristics. So for instance, the more higher people are on neuroticism or like lower on emotional stability, the more people tend to have these really intense event representations and also more PTSD symptoms. And in fact, in that last study, I didn't mention it, but we did include a brief measure of neuroticism and found that it also had a predictive role.
Yeah, thank you very much. Because of the reason for me to raise this rumination and worry, and I thought because the rumination is basically focusing on the past events.
Yeah.
So I think that it might be interesting to look at whether there would be differences in terms of the future and the past, specifically, when they have this recall, which might impact their memory functioning. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jin Wen. I have a follow-up question if there are. I'm just sort of waiting for others to put their hands up. So feel free to ask me the questions. I don't want to take over. Just while we're waiting to see another hand go up, Neva, I was curious about, so you're particularly interested in the mental representations and that relationship with thinking about the future. I'm curious about the role of event familiarity. And because I think I recall from that literature that that's important when thinking about future events. And I wonder what your prediction would be if you gave people an event specifically that was unfamiliar for them to imagine, whether some of those relationships would change and actually you'd get some stronger differences between past events and future events.
Well, yeah, so it would be like still a past event that people have actually experienced, but then a future event that people have trouble imagining or that seems like lower in likelihood.
Yeah, I just wonder if you played around with the familiarity or, like you say, the plausibility, you would not just see a decrease in the sort of ease of imagining and that kind of thing, but also maybe that some of those relationships might change because they're no longer relying on schema or episodic memory, but having to pull together from a broader set of categories when they're thinking about the future.
Yeah, I think they probably would be relying, like have less of those episodic things to draw on. But in some ways that is true when thinking about the future anyway, because like the future is less certain than the past, that people already have to draw more on like schematic knowledge. Yeah, but yeah, I do think that like the less easy it was for people to imagine the future thing in an event-like way, the weaker those relationships would be.
Yeah. I can't see any other hands for the moment. Let me ask you one other question. This topic, I'm curious because I can see some students here in the audience. The topic that you're looking at is really interesting, and there are certain different bodies of thought around how PTSD is conceptualized, and I'm curious about the kind of questions you've had from people in different research traditions and how that has shaped your thinking about what you're doing. For example, I know you just presented at SAMAC. What have been some challenges to the kinds of ideas that you've put forward?
Yeah, I really have only had the opportunity, like I would love to present this to more like clinical audiences in particular, because I really have presented it to mostly cognitive audiences. And then the main question that people frequently ask is the one about worry, and like how worry relates to PreTSD and PTSD, and like disentangling all of those things. Yeah.
That's interesting. Jinwen, I can see your hand is up, but I can't tell if it's up again, or I'm going to unmute you.
No, I don't think that for some reason it's not going to disappear.
Okay.
Yeah, for some reason, I don't know why. Do you want me to click it again?
No, it's okay. I'll just disable you from talking.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Miva, for sharing your research and your time today. We're really happy for you to be part of the seminar series. And I'm sure, you know, if people have follow-up research questions, they can contact you.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I should have put my email address on the slide.
Yeah, that's great. Well, if people are interested, they can email me and I'm happy to share it as well.
Yes, yeah, great.
Okay.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic. All the best with your research, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.